mention resurrection, and it's not unlikely that someone will imagine something equivalent to reincarnation, that reoccurring cycle of lives lived one after the other. For others, the mention of resurrection might provoke grotesque associations with reanimated corpses, perhaps not of the zombie kind, but something along the lines of what Lazarus experienced when Jesus called his dead friend out from the grave, still wrapped in his grave clothes. Resuscitation to live a slightly extended encore to exactly the same kind of mortal life that we're presently living. And you might actually recall in John's Gospel that Jesus' enemies were already plotting to assassinate poor Lazarus less than 1 week after Jesus had raised him from the dead. And if that's what we mean by resurrection, then you could well be forgiven for wanting to opt out of going through such a traumatic kind of experience. Several years ago, I was speaking with a young woman about the Christian hope of resurrection, and her initial response was one of horror. "I hate my body," she said. "The thought of being stuck in it forever is a nightmare to me." This young woman's daily struggle was to avoid cutting herself, to avoid physically harming herself, to express the deep disgust that she felt with her body, disgust over how others had treated her body in the past. She wanted to be free from, to find an escape from the shame and the vulnerability that she naturally associated with her own physical self. We're a culture that has a pretty troubled relationship with our bodies. We seem to be battling and nagging dissatisfaction with them. Tattoos, piercings, plastic surgery, fitness obsessions, hair replacement therapies, even the humble $15 haircut. Now, none of these things are necessarily forbidden to Christians at all. Yet each of them could potentially become a way of compensating for the sense of bodily dissatisfaction that we feel with ourselves, ways of overcoming the unsatisfying incompleteness that we feel about our own bodies. When our bodies simply refuse to deliver on what we long for, we can sometimes even turn against them. Self-harm and euthanasia are increasingly how our own culture responds to bodies that refuse to synchronize with our longings. And as we'll see tonight, it turns out that placing one's hope in a bodily resurrection is as unthinkable for many in our own day as it was for the ancient world that the Bible addresses. Notice at the beginning of our passage how Paul anticipates people scoffing at the very idea of wanting a bodily resurrection. Have a look with me at chapter 15, verse 35. Chapter 15, verse 35. Paul begins, "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come?" "How foolish," Paul responds. Paul responds to these questions by declaring, "How foolish." I always kind of thought that they were pretty good questions. At first, Paul's response might sound a little bit harsh. But Paul isn't addressing here people who have legitimate curiosity about the resurrection bodies, but rather those who are scoffing at the very idea as complete nonsense. Come on, Paul, really? Are we going to crawl out of our graves moaning in various stages of decomposition? What about if I die without a leg? What if I die when I'm bald or as a frail 90-year-old? Won't that make a nonsense out of your hope for the bodily resurrection? Paul is anticipating the objections of those believers for whom the very idea of being raised bodily from the dead was ridiculous or grotesque. And Paul has two answers to these kinds of mocking objection. First of all, Paul unpacks for us exactly what kind of relationship this mortal body has to our future resurrection bodies. Glance with me down to verse 36 of chapter 15. Verse 36. We read there, "What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body as He has determined, and to each kind of seed He gives its own body. Paul illustrates this body's relationship to our resurrected bodies by drawing upon the analogy of a seed and the tree that it will eventually grow into. In one sense, the seed and the tree it grows into are exactly the same thing, aren't they? They both share the same single identity. But there's also a sense that while it's still in seed form, the tree is still incomplete. It hasn't yet flourished to become all that it's destined to be. As one theologian I was reading this week pointed out, a seed does not reach its full bodily potential simply by being dug up, dusted off, and polished up into a state of pristine seediness. And neither will our own resurrection be a matter of simply digging up our corpses, dusting them off, and returning them to the peak condition of their early 20s. The body is destined for far greater glory than just an eternal rerun of young adulthood, as if that was the pinnacle of what God had intended for human existence. And this is Paul's point in the next few verses. Glance down with me to verse 39 and following. Not all flesh is the same. People have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, and fish another. There are also heavenly bodies, and there are earthly bodies. But the splendour of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendour of the earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendour, the moon another, and the stars another, and star differs from star in splendour. So it will be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonour, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. God always gives His creatures bodies that perfectly fit their destiny. Humans have a body befitting their place as rulers, caretakers of God's creation. Fish have a body that's befitting their place in the sea. Animals and birds have bodies perfectly suiting their ecosystems as well. Likewise with heavenly bodies, that is, bodies that inhabit the space. The sun, moon and stars all have bodies that befit their place in the heavens. We wouldn't expect an orangutan's body to be at home orbiting around the earth, nor would it be fitting if a human had a body that flared and flamed like the sun. God gives each kind of body a glory and an honour that befits its own ultimate destiny. And likewise, God's not going to raise us to life eternally dressed only in perishable, weak, mortal bodies, bodies that catch the flu twice a season, bodies that faint with exhaustion if we don't get our caffeine hit, bodies that often feel such a bad fit in representing who we feel ourselves to really be. No, in the same way that a fish fits in the sea and the sun fits in the sky, so our resurrection bodies will be fittingly transformed for the environment of eternity. But then Paul goes on to compare these bodies of ours with our resurrected bodies in a way that at first can be a little bit confusing. Have a glance down with me to verse 44 and following. Chapter 15, verse 44. We read that this body of ours is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man Adam became a living being, the last Adam a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth. The second man is of heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth. And as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. In speaking here of natural versus spiritual bodies, Paul isn't suggesting that we'll be transformed from having a body made of physical matter and atoms into some kind of ghost-like existence, from a physical body into having a spiritually ghosty, non-physical body. Rather, Paul is saying that our resurrected bodies won't be the product of natural procreative processes, the passing on of a parent's own mortal human DNA, life and chemistry to a newborn child. Instead, it'll be the spiritual power of God that gives our resurrected bodies their life. The same spiritual power that raised Jesus from the grave, glorious and immortal. It's ultimately not within the natural power of any of us to make our own bodies whole, to enjoy them as fully and completely as we long to. There is no course of medication, no experience of sexual compatibility. There is no physical conditioning, no scientific breakthrough, no surgical procedure that can ultimately deliver the kind of bodily wholeness we so long for. Only the resurrection power of God's Spirit can truly and completely make us at home in these physical bodies of ours. The promise of the resurrection truly is wonderful news for those of us who feel most frustrated with or alienated from our physical selves. For those of us who struggle with same-sex attraction, for those of us who bear the burden of gender dysphoria, for any of us who feel with every ounce of our being that our physical bodies just don't sync with how we know and experience ourselves. For those of us who crave sexual intimacy as single people, for those of us who are tempted to look for sexual fulfillment and intimacy outside the painful or lonely marriages that you find yourselves a part of, obeying God can often feel like we're denying the one thing we feel sure could guarantee us bodily fulfillment and wholeness. Now, Paul knows how crippling this can feel, as he writes in Romans chapter 8:23. We ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. As good and wonderful as these mortal bodies of ours can be, they are only the seed of what God promises they are yet to become, something far more glorious. And nothing we might grasp after in our own strength could ever deliver the kind of bodily wholeness we so desperately long for. That kind of transformation takes the working power of God's own Spirit. Every 6 months or so, our community revisits debates about euthanasia, how we as a society might best love those who are deeply suffering. I myself have known those who have died not being able to control bowel movements or speak properly, or feed themselves. And it's becoming more and more common for people to argue that such an experience of life is undignified, not worth protecting, that it dishonours the memory of our healthy, vigorous, youthful selves to allow people to go on living like that. That it makes no sense to value life that ends in what is now considered such indignity. There are almost certainly some amongst us who have also been shamefully abused and mistreated in their bodies, and who are therefore unjustly burdened by the shame of what others have done to them, of how others have mistreated them, misused their bodies. There will be others who continue to struggle with the shame of what they themselves have done with their own bodies. For many people, life in these bodies is crushingly painful because of the abuse, the sin, or the loss that it constantly reminds them of. We can't imagine that we'll ever find any lasting peace in bodies like these. Yet for Christians, the hope of the bodily resurrection teaches us not to despise or to hate our bodies. The hope of the bodily resurrection reminds us of God's promise to free us from the shame, from the memories, from the pain, and from the weaknesses that can make living our bodily lives such a struggle for so many of us. The promise of the bodily resurrection from the dead teaches us not only to avoid idolizing these present bodies of ours, it teaches us not to despise or to hate them in their weakness, but instead to hope for the transformation of them by God's power at the resurrection. C.S. Lewis makes this point beautifully when he writes, "It's a serious thing to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship." And friends, that is as true for how we think about ourselves as it is for how we are to think about others. We are destined to share in the likeness, the image of the Lord Jesus himself. And that's the wonderful truth that we'll return again to next week for our final week in 1 Corinthians chapter 15.